Hello! It is time for me to do my yearly review of one of the two subscription services I use. The other is Stitch Fix. I got this shirt from them yesterday. And that, of course, is Book of the Month. Now, I am not sponsored by Book of the Month, so these are entirely my own opinions, and this will be what I thought of the books they offered and I picked from 2022. I'm going to begin by saying that so many of you lovely viewers have used my discount code for Book of the Month this year. So I've gotten a ton of add-ons, which you will see because I bought a lot of books from Book of the Month this year. There are some monthly add-ons, which they do some months, not every month. And then I also have some backlist titles from years before, and I will be reviewing all of them. So I use kind of a weird rating system, and that is because I don't really give books 1 star ever because I don't read a book that I think is going to get 1 star. I will not finish it. So my rating system is as follows. The lowest rating is something that I call not for me. This book was just not for me. Obviously, I think it's a well-written book, and there's going to be for a lot of people, especially if Book of the Month picked it, but it just wasn't a story that worked for me. The next one is my okay tier. These are the books that I might have found parts of them endearing, liked certain aspects of it, but overall, it just wasn't a book that I really enjoyed that much. Middle ground is a solid read. These are books that I liked while reading them. After that is great. Great are like my books that are like 4 to 4.5 stars that I really had a fun time with and definitely will think about for a while. Is my camera angle? I think it's fine, right? Am I a little off? And lastly is Put It in My Veins. Those are my 5-star reads that are like immediate favorites. Best books of the year, best books of my life. Okay, how many books did I buy this year from Book of the Month? 25. If I had a better camera setup, I would show you how I have them all beautifully stacked down there. It's very pretty. I should have taken a picture because I'm about to destroy them. So that is about 2 books a month plus 1. And I didn't do it like that. Some months I got 1 book. Some months I got 3 books. One month I got 0 books. So let's get into the books that I picked. We are going to start with the backlist titles that I got that are from years past and review those first. Beginning with The 7 Husbands of Evelyn Hugo by Taylor Jenkins Reid. And this was a Put It in My Veins, best book of the year, amazing read that I really loved. It tells the story of a Hollywood starlet's life framed by her marriages. And it's really more the story of a lifelong love. And I loved this book so much. I understand the hype now. Next, we've got The Book of Longings by Sue Monk Kidd. This is a historical fiction, sort of fantasy, what-if type novel. And the what-if is, what if Jesus was married to a woman who was a little bit revolutionary for her time period? And I really enjoyed this book a lot. This is another Put It in My Veins. I thought it was fantastic. It's a tearjerker, though, just so you know. Next up, Ariadne by Jennifer Saint. Another Put It in My Veins. This is a mythology retelling of Ariadne, who is best known as the sister of the Minotaur and the wife of Dionysus. And you follow her entire life. And I'm a sucker for those kind of mythology retellings where you just follow someone for, decades or millennium. And did not disappoint. She has a new book coming out this year about Atalanta, and I can't wait to read it. Next up, Daisy Jones and the Six by Taylor Jenkins Reid. Again, Put It in My Veins. This is a fictional sort of interview telling of a band like Fleetwood Mac. I don't know if you saw, but they just released the trailer for the Amazon Prime series about it. And, I'm not going to remember who it is. One of the guys from Mumford & Sons and Phoebe, what is her name? Bridges? Yeah, Phoebe Bridges and someone else wrote all the songs from this. So if you haven't seen that, I can't wait to watch it because I really loved this book. It was great. I gave it to my sister-in-law for Christmas. And lastly, I got The Broken Girls by Simone St. James. And this was another Put It in My Veins. This was a fantastic thriller that definitely converted me to a Simone St. James fan. In this one, we have Fiona Sheridan, and she is determined to solve 2 murders that took place in the same spot, sort of, 60 years apart. And I loved it. So obviously all my backlist titles were Put It in My Veins amazing, like some of the best books I read of the year, which makes sense because obviously I'm not just picking random backlists that no one talks about. They're mostly books that have been like really popular, and that's why I'm picking them. So it makes sense, but they were fantastic. Okay, now let's start doing month by month. In January, I got The Magnolia Palace by Fiona Davis. This is a historical fiction, and I would say this is a solid read. We have 2 time periods in this, the first being the early 1920s, and the second being, I believe it's the early 70s, it might be the late 60s. And we follow an artist model in the 20s and a regular model in the 60s, 70s. I really enjoyed this because it's kind of one of those historical fictions that's not about time periods that are saturated in historical fiction. So the 1920s was really fun. It takes place in a mansion in New York City, which was a cool setting. And in the 1920s, it's a mansion that a family lives in. And in the 60s, 70s, it's a museum, which I had never heard of this place, but apparently it's a real place. I thought it was a fun, solid historical fiction read in a time period which doesn't get a lot of views. In February, I got The Golden Couple by Greer Hendricks and Sarah Pekkanen, and this is a domestic thriller about a husband, a wife, and their therapist. I would say this is like solid read, borderline great. I really enjoyed how the author kept you guessing about who the baddie was. It all stems from the wife wanting to tell the husband that she's had an affair, sort of like she cheated on him one night, and then the story goes from there. It was definitely exciting. I think I read it in 2 days, which that's a good mark of a thriller if you read it very fast. Okay, so March was kind of a crazy month for me. So I purchased 3 books in March, but then I ended up getting another of the March books as an add-on later, and I can't remember exactly what month, so I popped it in here too. So I got The Paris Apartment by Lucy Foley. And this book, sadly, I only thought was like okay. I had really high hopes, which is part of the reason I might have rated it lower because everyone talked so much about the guest list about it being fantastic. So I was like, I have to try this one. But it follows a bunch of people who live in an apartment in Paris and like a murder mystery. I think that if you like more mysteries than thrillers, you'd like this one. So this was not a thriller, it was a mystery, and I am finding that I tend to like thrillers more than mysteries. I did like the setting a lot and some of the characters, but some of the characters I didn't really jive with that much. Next, I got The Cartographers by Peng Shepherd, and I would say this was okay, borderline solid read, and I will tell you why. This is a very cool premise. It's about a woman who sort of dives into the history of her parents' friend group when they're in their 20s and how a map destroyed their friendship. And it takes place in a lot of like library type settings, which I really like. Here's why it didn't work for me, and it would probably work for a lot of people. So I am a librarian, and there was just some library stuff in here that took me out of the story because it seemed too unrealistic. And also there's like some very unrealistic stuff with a small child, which that is just something that like doesn't work for me if children are written in stories, and it just seems too fanciful. But I did really like the ending a lot of this. Like I thought the last 100 pages were fantastic. So, you know, it's like on that okay, solid read borderline for me. Next, I got The Love of My Life by Rosie Walsh. Here's a picture of it. I actually sold this and didn't read it because when I purchased it, I did not realize it had a cancer plotline, which I don't like reading books like that. So someone in my neighborhood bought it off Facebook Marketplace, and I hope they love it. And then lastly, an add-on I got later, but actually was one of the books of the month in March, was the Book of Cold Cases by Simone St. James. And I really liked this. I would say this one was great. So you have 2 timelines in this, and you have Shay in like modern times. I think it's supposed to be like 2017 or 2019. It's pre-pandemic. And she has survived a killer as a child. And now she runs like a true crime website. And then you have Beth, who was arrested and tried as a serial killer in the 70s, but was acquitted. And Beth doesn't do interviews, but she decides to let Shay interview her. I really liked this book a lot. This is the year that I got to know Simone St. James. I really liked both her books that I read a lot this year. And this one in particular had some supernatural stuff in it that I really liked. So I'm very specific about the kind of supernatural stuff I like in thrillers. And both of her books had that. And I'm not going to tell you what it is because that'll ruin the story for you. Now in April, I picked Kayakei by Vaishnavi Patel. And this was like kind of a hard one to review for me because I thought the first 100 pages of it were fantastic. Like I probably would have rated those as great, but then I just kind of fell out of love with the story and couldn't connect with, it wasn't that I couldn't connect with the characters because I loved the beginning, but there were some more things that are just like personal pet peeves of mine about like the way children are written in novels, and that's just how I read them. It ended up being kind of a book that was not for me, but I will say one of my best friends read it and she put it more like a solid read. So if you have any interest in like Hindu mythology retellings, I would recommend it still. It's about Kayakei, who is the villain in the Ramayana, which I've never read, but there was like some very divisive things on Goodreads when you read it about people not believing that she should have a story. But so you might really like it. It is one of those mythology retellings that I feel like a lot of people still jived with, but just was one of those where certain parts of the writing I just couldn't get into. All right, in May, I got Breathless by Amy McCullough. And this was a thriller, and it was great. This is about a climbing expedition on an extremely tall mountain, which I'm going to forget the name of, Mountain Slough, and about people dying, but our main character can't tell whether or not they're dying due to the elements or if maybe there's a killer loose. Her name is Cecily, and she's kind of like an amateur climber, and she's up there to interview one of the most famous climbers in the world. And I loved this book. I read it in like 2 days. My cousin loved this book and read it in like 2 days. My husband DNF'd it. So this is just, people have such different tastes. So I thought he'd love it. He likes mountain climbing a lot. He wasn't into it. Next, I got Siren Queen by Neva, which I was so excited when this was an add-on because I wanted this book so badly. And this was Put It In My Veins, fantastic, one of my best books of the year. This book is like a mythology retelling of early Hollywood, if that makes sense. So you follow this woman who's named Luli Wei, and she is she's born in America, but she's of Chinese descent, and she wants to be famous. And it's really cool. It's like making deals with demons who are the heads, like executives in Hollywood studios. And this is just so like visually cool. I really hope it gets like made into a miniseries or something because I think it'd be so cool to watch. So please, somebody call Nevo and try to get this on HBO because I think they do a really good job with it. Moving on to June, we have Woman of Light by Kali Fajardo Anstein. And this book was fantastic. This was like great, put it in my veins, borderline. I really enjoyed this book. And it's a historical fiction that takes place in the 1930s in Denver, but then you have some flashbacks to the 1880s that are more like not like in the city, more like in the West, I guess, like the mountain area of the country. I obviously don't know a lot about Western geography, but you follow Luce, and it's kind of like, it's not a coming of age because she's already an adult, but it's kind of like going from a young adult to an actual adult is how I feel like this story be best described. It has a lot to do with the racism that's like rampant, obviously, at that time period in America, and just her family, and the flashbacks to the 1880s are about her grandparents, and I fell in love with those sections of the book. I thought they were absolutely fantastic. I'm definitely going to read more books by this author because her writing style was also gorgeous. As an add-on in June, I got The Hotel Nantucket by Ellen Hilderbrand. This is my first Ellen Hilderbrand, and I thought it was great. This is like the definition of a beach read, and it was perfect to read in June to like get ready for the summer. It takes place on the island of Nantucket, obviously, and it's narrated by everyone who works at this hotel called the Hotel Nantucket, which is a new hotel that's opening, and you just kind of follow everybody's lives. It's like a real light read, but not uninteresting. One of the narrators also is a 19-year-old ghost from the early 1900s, which I loved because she's written as a 19-year-old. Like, she hasn't matured at all in her over 100 years of haunting this hotel, which was really fun. So if you want something light that makes you feel like summer, grab this. So July was actually the only month I did not get anything. I didn't love anything that was coming out, even though the book that ended up being the book of the year, Tomorrow, was a July book. None of the books were really like grabbing me. And I think at that point I maybe hadn't finished reading both my June books. So I was just like, I don't know, I'll just skip it. So I did. My first time skipping a month. I don't feel bad about it. I bought 25 books this year. In August, I got Small Angels by Lauren Owen, which is a gothic fiction, and I would call it a solid read. So this book is about like an evil forest that encroaches on this town. And if you are an aesthetic person, which I very much love looking at, like, I'm like a Pinterest person because of my age. So like I love just like looking up aesthetics and getting lost in them. And there's that new aesthetic, it's not that new, but cottage gore. This book is cottage gore. If you want, this is like Evil Woods type of book. And it is a little bit of a slower read because I realized after I bought it that gothic fiction does not equal gothic thriller. So there's definitely more of a slow build, definitely more like of an unease. It also took me longer to read because it is so like, creepy is the wrong word. I think unease is the right word, that I wasn't reading it at night. I was literally only reading it like in the middle of the day outside while my kids were playing and the sun was shining. I didn't want to read it before bed because it would just give me sort of like an uneasy feeling, which is what gothic fiction is supposed to do. So solid read. If you're looking for cottage gore or like goblin core or whatever you call it, try this one. I actually got this next book as an add-on in September, but it was one of the August picks. So Daisy Darker by Alice Feeney. This is, again, a really hard book for me to rate. So this is a thriller. It also takes place over Halloween. So I would recommend, if you're going to read it in the fall, because I read it like right at the beginning of September and I wasn't like super in the fall vibes yet. I loved this book and I hated the ending. So I think I rated it a solid read, because I'd say the whole book was great, but then the ending was like, okay. So it just dropped it down for me. This is about a family that is meeting on this island for the matriarch's 80th birthday. And when there's high tide, the island gets completely cut off from civilization and you can't reach the mainland. So it's got a lot of And Then There Were None vibes, because obviously people are going to start dying. And it's just, I don't know. I really, really liked it. And then I couldn't stick the ending for me, which was too bad. In September, I picked Other Birds by Sarah Addison Allen. Put this in my veins. I loved this book. First of all, this was like the perfect read when I read it, because I had read The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue, which I didn't get from Book of the Month, but they have it, which is very depressing. It's very good, but it's very depressing. And I was in such a emotional state. And this is like the perfect antidote. So you follow a group of people who all live in this condominium building that's very small. There's only, I think, like 6 different condos. And it's their stories. And they're all like a little bit magical. So this is magical realism. And like the main character is 18 or 19. But her name's Zoe, and she's just moved in because it was her mother's condo, who she really hasn't had contact with. And she has an invisible pet bird. And then another guy who lives in the building wakes up every morning covered in cornmeal, because it's his way of his dead mother telling him that she's still watching out for him. It's beautiful. If you've ever read Sarah Addison Allen before, her books are just like, I think like they're the definition of magical realism. They are rooted in this world, but they have such like everyday magic woven through them that they're gorgeous. Also, she has a really, really great talent of not writing romance, but being able to write like 2 lines that make you believe in the romance of a story. Look at us, we're already at October. So in October, I got The Family Game by Catherine Steadman. And this was a solid read thriller. So I was a little surprised that this book came out in October and not November, because it is set between Thanksgiving and Christmas. So reading it in early October did feel a little bit odd. I would definitely recommend, if you're going to read it next year, to wait until November to get those, like, because the vibes are so holiday season in New York City and like upstate New York that I feel like that's the time of year to read it. In this, we have Harry, who has written sort of like a runaway bestseller, and she is recently engaged to a very wealthy man. She's British. He's like old money America. His name's Edward. And she really quickly realizes that his family is insanely wealthy, and they are also very weird. And they are also very dangerous. So there's a lot of like secrets and stuff like that in the book. I liked this book. I thought that there's a big thing with Harry like having blackmail hung over her head. And I wasn't sure I definitely believed that the blackmail was enough for her to go through with the things she did. But I still found it very entertaining. And I still think that if you need a quick thriller to read between the holiday season, like the Thanksgiving to Christmas holiday season, this is a very good one. Next, in October as an add-on, I got Spells for Forgetting by Adrienne Young. This book, I would say, like, great borderline solid read. It takes place on an island in the Pacific Northwest, and everyone on the island is magical, or at least like believes in magic. This is a book that was fantasy, but honestly, for me, it leaned magical realism. And that might be because I read a lot of fantasy, and there's not that much outward fantasy in it. It's much more like folklore-y type feeling, and like, I don't know how to explain it, but I don't know. That was part of it. I think that for me, like, I didn't really buy this as a fantasy, but it felt more magical realism. Moving on. It's about this island and a horrible tragic event that took place, I think it's like 15 years earlier or 14 years earlier, that led to one of the people at the island leaving and abandoning the girl, because they're like 18, he was supposed to marry and take with him. So this has a lot of different narrators. The main 2 narrators are Emery and August. August is the guy that had to leave, and Emery is the woman, now she's in her 30s, he left behind. But you also get so many narrators. The past, the present, you jump around in time a ton. So I thought that was really fun. I did really like this book. I feel like as time has gone on, I don't remember it as well. So it didn't, like, a lot of the specifics didn't stick with me. But it definitely has like good fall Pacific Northwest vibes with witches-ish. Sort of witches. They're not even really witches. I don't know. Magical realism. In November, I got The Wilder Women by Ruth Emmy Lang. And this is a magical realism. It was touted as that. This book is about a pair of sisters, Zadie and Finn. And 5 years earlier, their mother disappeared. And when she did, Finn was 13. I guess she'd have to be about 13 because she's 18 in the present. And Zadie was like 21-ish. And when their mother disappeared, Zadie tried to fight for custody of Finn and lost it. So Finn has been living in foster care, and Zadie's been kind of like trying to make something out of her life and having a difficult time of it. Finn has just turned 18. It's the summer after her senior year of high school. The two of them are going to go on a road trip. They are supposed to go to, I think, Gulf Shores. It takes place they're in Texas at the beginning. But when Zadie shows up, Finn says, actually, I want to look for mom. They both have weird magical realism powers. Zadie is a psychic who refuses to use her powers. She hasn't used them since her mom left. And Finn can like read memories. So if she goes certain places, like people's memories, and the people don't even have to be there, kind of echo through her. And Finn wants them to use their powers to find their mom. It's a road trip book. So you start in Texas and then you go through the desert and all the way up to the Pacific Northwest. The first half of this book is like the most desert vibes you'll ever get in any book. So if you like desert vibes books, get this one. I would say this is kind of like a meandering book. I put it at a solid read because it was one of those books that I enjoyed reading, but I never felt like I had to pick it up. Like it didn't really like put its claws in you. And it's way more of a character development book than a plot book. So it's really about how Zadie and Finn change as people through this trip than about what's actually happening on the trip. But still, I liked the time I spent with it. As an add-on in November, I got The Cloisters by Katie Hayes. And put this in my vein. It's a gothic fiction, and oh my, did they write this specifically for me. So this book is about Anna, who has been living her entire life in this small town in Washington State. She's gone to a small liberal arts college there, and she wants out. Her father has died recently in a hit-and-run accident, and her mom has fallen apart, and she can't handle living there anymore. She was like a early Renaissance or late medieval art major in undergrad, which I didn't know you were allowed to be that specific in undergrad, but maybe you are. I did not go to art school. And gets a internship at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So she can go live in New York City, and then she figures she'll apply to master's programs while she's out there, and she'll never go back to Washington again. So she goes, and when she gets there, they tell her they don't actually have a place for her anymore because the guy she's supposed to be working with got like a grant to go to Germany or something. As soon as this happens, this man walks in, Patrick, from the Cloisters, which is a museum of medieval art in New York City that I didn't know existed, and now I have to go to New York to go to it, and says that they can use her. What happens next is like this crazy world of like interpersonal relationships with people you work with, but also they're on this mission to find like the oldest tarot cards. I love tarot cards. I did a video about tarot cards, I think this October or last October? I don't know. October 2022, I think. So that was very exciting for me to read about. It's, when I think gothic fiction, how I said like Small Angels was kind of slow, this is more what I was picturing. It's not slow, but you get like a lot of dread building, and the ending of this hit me from left field. It totally made sense once I read it, but I was just like, what? So that was exciting. So I loved this book. If you like dark academia, read this book. It's fantastic. It's at Target also. Last month of the year, December, I picked Babel by R.F. Kuang. And I'm not done with this book yet. So I'm about 100 pages in. It's divided into parts, and I just finished, books. I just finished book one. So I can't really give you a review on it yet. I will say that I do feel like the first book or part is really just setting the stage of the world. And the last chapter I read really felt like now I'm in the story. So I'm going to read this kind of slowly, I believe. I have been reading a couple chapters, then reading a different book, reading a couple chapters, reading a different book. But I do think I'm going to like the middle more. The beginning just is a little bit slow, but I kind of understand that. I try to keep in mind, one of my favorite books is The Mist of Avalon, which I know is an extremely problematic favorite, but whenever I would used to recommend that to people, I would always say you have to read 200 pages to get into it, which is a lot to read to get into a book, but when you're reading a book that's like 900 pages long, it kind of makes sense. This kind of felt like you have to read 100 pages to get into it, and it's almost 550 pages, so it kind of makes sense. So I am excited to get into the meat of the story and hopefully really enjoy it. Lastly, after you've been a member for a year, Book of the Month lets you pick one of the books of the year as a free add-on. And so I picked A Flicker in the Dark by Stacey Willingham. I would rate this like a solid read. So this is about Chloe, who is a therapist, and 20-ish years ago, she found evidence that put her father in jail for the rest of his life for being a serial killer of like young teen girls. Now, it's 20 years later, she's engaged, she's a therapist, she's feeling good about her life, and similar crimes start to happen. So I did think that Stacey Willingham did a really good job at constantly shifting who Chloe thinks is like after her, if that makes sense. Like someone's being menacing. Who's being menacing? Who's responsible for these new crimes? That kind of stuff. They did a really good job. So you're not, sometimes I feel like when you read thrillers, there's one person that the character is focused on the entire time, which is obviously not going to be the person. It shifts a lot. So you're like, oh, okay. So her perspective is shifting a lot. The only reason I didn't rate it higher is because I had to sort of like really think what this book was about. I have read a lot of thrillers lately, but it took me a second to remember which one this was. So it didn't like brand itself in my brain, but I still liked it. It was good. Okay. Those were all the books I read. So let's do a rating breakdown, and I'm gonna grab my computer because I can't do this by heart. So I had 8 books that were put this in my veins, my highest rating, 5 books that were great, 7 books that were a solid read, 2 books that were okay, 1 book that was not for me, 1 book that I haven't finished yet, and 1 book that I am not gonna read, which is pretty good. And I also have to tell you, I had to do this like 7 times because my math wasn't mathing, and it's like simple addition. So just, if your brain is young, enjoy it. But that's great. I mean, look how many books, and a lot of the put this in my veins were books from other years, but I had a lot of greats and a lot of solid reads. I don't consider my solid reads bad reads. I think they're good investments to read. Very few that I didn't like. 1 that was not for me, 2 that were okay. Not bad. My overall thoughts. Look, I love Book of the Month. I love it. I joined it in 2021 as a way for me to stop reading only fantasy and romance, which is what I was doing because I love reading all different genres. And I've done a really, really good job at that. I think I had 6 fantasy this year out of my 25, and I had 0 romance, which is normal because I don't usually like the Book of the Month usually picks rom-coms, and I'm not a rom-com reader. I'm more like historical and paranormal romances. But it's doing what I wanted it to do. And I'm never going to stop, probably. No, I will probably eventually stop, but no time soon. If this video has made you want to try Book of the Month, I'm going to put my discount code in the description so you can click on it and get yourself a discount. I forgot to look up beforehand what the current discount is for referrals, so I will write it in the description and you'll know. And you know what? I'm filming this on January 26th, and the book picks for the next month are going to come out really soon, and I can't wait. I hope you are in the middle of a good book, about to start reading a good book, or about to start writing a great book. See you soon.